For each fight on this weekend's upcoming card, including for the prelims, I'm going to be comparing stats, reviewing recent fighter history, analyzing the results of my 7 data science prediction models, and giving a combined weighted prediction based on those models. I'll also provide my final prediction combining both quantitative and qualitative information together. Later this week, I'll upload a video covering promising underdogs, best and expensive favorites, and prop bets for y'all to consider, which I'll highlight some great opportunities for you guys. Hopefully you can use these predictions and data to confirm your picks, avoid mistakes, find value bets, or just informative and entertainment purposes to prepare for the lead up to this weekend's event. Please like and subscribe if you find this content interesting, informative, or helpful. It helps keep me motivated to create these videos for you all. I've also added my Patreon information in the description if you'd like to support the channel through that. There's a $10 a month contribution tier and a $20 a month premium tier, which will give you early access to all of the analysis and results for my videos, as well as additional data analysis and stats. So that includes my prediction model results, fighter history, stat overviews, promising underdogs, best and expensive favorites, prop bets to consider, and a deep dive into each fighter's record history and an analysis through each of their individual historical fights. So you'll get all sorts of stats and data analysis which will help you with your picks and bets. And for $20 a month, which is around $5 per event, you can get all of that information. You can purchase event analysis separately, but the membership is cheaper and easier. Plus, you're directly helping improve and expand the content of this channel. Running this data and analysis, each of the prediction models, the fight simulations, and updating the site takes hours every day and week, so I'd greatly appreciate your support. And thank you all for the recent support that you have shown. It truly means the world to me that we can share our passion for MMA and continue to build this community together. The last thing that I want to mention is that there is a BetUS promotion in the description below. If you use that link, it's an affiliate link, so if you set up your account, you'll get a promotional offer with that. I'm excited to continue working on this analysis and content for you all. Thank you guys again for all of your support. Let's go ahead and dive right into the predictions. For the first fight, we have Modestas Bukauskas versus Marcin Prachnio. Let's go ahead and review their stats. Modestas is 6 feet 3 inches tall with a reach of 78 inches and he's 30 years old. And on the other hand, Marcin is 6 feet 3 inches tall as well with a reach of 74 inches and is 36 years old. When it comes to striking, Modestas lands 3.28 strikes per minute at a 41% accuracy. And Marcin, on the other hand, lands 5.61 strikes per minute at a 55% accuracy. Now, as far as grappling goes, Modestas Bukauskas doesn't really have any grappling stats recorded, but Marcin Prachnio does. He lands 0.17 takedowns on average with a 20% accuracy. And when it comes to defense, Modestas Bukauskas absorbs 3.87 strikes per minute with a 50% striking defense and a 71% takedown defense, whereas Marcin Prachnio absorbs 3.3 strikes per minute with a 54% striking defense and a 58% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Modestas Bukauskas' recent fight history. Recently, he's coming off of a loss against Vitor Prachnio via KO/TKO, which was back in November of 2023. His total record is 15 wins and 6 losses, and out of those 15 wins, 9 of them were KO/TKOs, 2 of them were submissions, and 4 were decision victories, which gives him a 73% finishing rate. Now, out of his 6 losses, 4 of those were via KO/TKO, 1 of them was a submission, and 1 was a decision loss. He does have 6 first-round finishes, and recently he's been on a tear. He's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, but he is coming off of a loss recently into this fight. His most recent win was back in June of 2023, and his most recent loss was back in November of 2023. Now let's take a look at Marcin Prachnio's recent fight history. Recently, he's coming off of a win against Devin Clark via unanimous decision, which was back in February of 2024. His total record is 17 wins and 7 losses, and out of his 17 wins, 11 of them were KO/TKOs, 1 was a submission, and 5 were decision victories, which gives him a 71% finishing rate. Now, out of his 7 losses, 4 of them were KO/TKOs, 1 was a submission, and 2 were decision losses. He has 11 first-round finishes. Recently, he's done well. He's won 3 out of his last 5 fights, and he is coming off of a win into this fight. His most recent win was back in February of this year, and his most recent loss was in July of last year. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted, their weighted average, and my final pick that takes that and adds other non-statistics based research and fight film study observations into account as well. None of my prediction models are leaning towards Modestas Bukauskas, and all 7 are leaning towards Marcin Prachnio. And when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 70% probability of victory for Marcin Prachnio. However, I'm actually going to go opposite of the prediction models here based on all of my research and the fights that I've seen, and I'm going to give Modestas Bukauskas a 52.6% probability of victory. And there's several reasons for that, both statistically and outside of statistics as well. Starting with what's on paper, Modestas Bukauskas is 6 years younger, he has a reach advantage of 4 inches, and he has a 13% higher takedown defense. He's won 15 fights, he's finished 73% of them, he's won 3 of his 7 UFC fights, and recently he's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he's only just now coming off of a loss. But let's talk about those reasons aside from stats alone. Modestas Bukauskas, I think, has the upper hand over Marcin Prachnio due to his versatile striking, his mental resilience, and his experience as a champion. Bukauskas' ability to switch his stances and his background in kickboxing, which, if you research, he has a great background in kickboxing, it makes him a pretty challenging opponent for Prachnio, who has shown some defensive vulnerabilities recently. Now, while Prachnio does have knockout power and he has a good karate base, his inconsistency and his susceptibility to knockouts could probably be exploited by Bukauskas in this matchup. If Bukauskas can maintain his composure in this fight and really utilize his reach advantage, he's probably going to be able to control this fight and secure himself a victory. I don't think he's going to get the finish if I'm being honest, so I'm going to take Modestas Bukauskas via decision. For the next fight, we have Shauna Bannon versus Alice Ardeleon. Let's go ahead and review their stats. Shauna Bannon is 5 feet 5 inches tall with a reach of 65 inches, and she's 30 years old. And on the other hand, Alice is 5 feet 3 inches tall with a reach of 61 inches, and she's 32 years old. Now, before we get into these fighting stats, I do want to let you guys know that Shauna's stats come from only one of her fights. Not only that, but Alice doesn't really have any stats recorded, so this is going to be a limited analysis when it comes to the statistical side, but I'm still going to review their stylistic matchup and all that good stuff. Anyways, when it comes to striking, what we do have is that Shauna Bannon lands 3.6 strikes per minute with a 37% accuracy. And when it comes to defense, she absorbs 3.73 strikes per minute with a 37% striking defense and a 33% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Shauna Bannon's recent fight history. Recently, she's coming off of a loss against Bruna, Brasil via unanimous decision, which was back in July of 2023. Her total record is 5 wins and only 1 loss. And out of her 5 wins, 2 of them were KO/TKOs and the other 3 were decision victories, which gives her a 40% finishing rate. Her only loss again was that 1 decision loss from last year. She does have 1 first round finish, and recently, of course, she's won 4 out of her last 5 fights, but she is coming off of that loss into this fight, which might hurt her momentum. Her most recent win was back in March of last year, and her most recent loss was back in July of last year. Now let's take a look at Alice's recent fight history. She's actually making her debut this weekend. Her total record is 8 wins and 5 losses, and out of those 8 wins, 4 of them were KO/TKOs, 3 of them were submissions, and 1 was a decision victory, which gives her an 88% finishing rate. But honestly, she hasn't been too impressive, and she's received a lot of pushback for being on UFC 304. A lot of people don't think that she deserves it. I'll leave the opinions up to you guys. I'm going to give you guys logic, stats, and analysis, and I'll stick to that. Now, out of her 5 losses, 2 of them were submissions, and 3 of them were decision losses. She does have 5 first-round finishes. Recently, she's won all 5 of her last 5 fights, so she's on that 5-fight win streak. Her most recent win was in August of 2023, and her most recent loss was actually all the way back in May of 2016. But again, keep in mind, she hasn't really faced tough opponents. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't run both of these fighters through my prediction models because of that debut. However, the odd probabilities are giving Shauna Bannon a 66% probability of victory, and I generally agree with that because Shauna Bannon has that height advantage of 2 inches. She's 2 years younger, and she has that reach advantage of 4 inches. She's won 5 fights. She's finished 40% of them. She hasn't won her 1 UFC fight, but recently she's still won 4 out of her last 5 fights, and she's faced better opponents than Alice has. But talking about reasons aside from stats alone, taking a look at that stylistic factor, I think that Shauna holds that upper hand due to her aggressive striking, her high-level kickboxing background, and her overall strong mental resilience. Now, despite her recent loss, Bannon's ambition and her training support from some of those notable figures like Conor McGregor, think what you want about him, but that's still pretty big. I think that positions her pretty well for success, or at least, better odds than someone like Alice would have stepping into this fight. However, I will acknowledge that Alice does have some good experience. She is kind of versatile and she has a crazy winning streak, at least on paper, right? That does make her kind of a challenge and it gives her some momentum. She has something to prove, and I think that she'll try to make a point on 304, although I don't think she'll find much success. I think that this fight will be kind of closely contested, sort of, before Shauna really takes that lead. And I do think that Shauna does have good striking skills that's going to put her in the lead later in the fight, or at least maybe round 2, round 3. I don't think that there's any harm in taking Shauna Bannon via decision, so that is where I'm leaning for this fight. For the next fight, we have Sam Patterson versus Kiefer Crosbie. Let's go and review their stats. Sam is 6 feet 3 inches tall with a reach of 78 inches and he's 28 years old. And on the other hand, Crosbie is 5 feet 11 inches tall with a reach of 70 inches and is 34 years old. Right off the bat, that is a crazy height and reach advantage for Sam Patterson. Now, before we get into these fighting stats, I do need to let you guys know that Crosbie's stats come from only one fight. So now that I got that disclaimer out of the way, when it comes to striking, Sam Patterson lands 2.54 strikes per minute at a 38% accuracy. Now, Crosbie, on the other hand, because of that one fight, he lands 8.1 strikes per minute at a 66% accuracy. As far as grappling goes, Sam lands 1.19 takedowns on average with a pretty decent accuracy, while Crosbie, on the other hand, doesn't really have any grappling stats recorded. Now, when it comes to defense, Sam absorbs 3.41 strikes per minute with a 49% striking defense and a 33% takedown defense, whereas Crosbie absorbs 6.02 strikes per minute with a 50% striking defense and not really any takedown defense recorded. Now let's take a look at Sam Patterson's recent fight history. Recently, Sam's coming off of a win against Johan Lioness via submission back in January of this year. His total record is 11 wins and only 2 losses, and out of his 11 wins, 4 of them were KO/TKOs, 6 of them were submissions, and 1 was a decision victory, which gives him a really high 91% finishing rate. Out of his 2 losses, both of them were via KO/TKO, so he might be a little bit vulnerable to strikes and finishes. He also has 5 first-round finishes. Recently, he's been on a tear. He's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of a win into this fight. His most recent win was back in January of 24, and his most recent loss was back in March of last year. Now let's take a look at Kiefer Crosbie's recent fight history. Recently, he's coming off of a loss against Kevin Jousset via submission back in September of last year. His total record is 10 wins and 3 losses, and out of his 10 wins, 5 of them were KO/TKOs, 2 of them were submissions, and 3 were decision victories, which gives him a 70% finishing rate. Out of his 4 losses, 1 was a KO/TKO, 2 of them were submissions, and he doesn't have any decision losses. He has 5 first-round finishes. Recently, he hasn't done too well. He's only won 2 out of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of a loss to come into this fight. His most recent win was back in April of 2023, and his most recent loss was back in September of 2023. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted, their weighted average, and my final pick that takes that and adds other non-statistics based research and fight film study observations into account as well. 3 of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Sam, and 4 are leaning towards Crosbie. And when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 51.7% probability of victory for Sam. Now for my final prediction, I'm going to give him a little bit more confident 66% probability of victory, and there's quite a few reasons for that. On paper, he has a height advantage of 4 inches, he's 6 years younger, he has a reach advantage of 8 inches, and he absorbs 2.61 less strikes per minute. He's won 11 fights, finished 91% of them, he's won 1 out of his 2 UFC fights, recently winning 4 out of his last 5, and he's coming off of a win into this fight. Now, talking about reasons aside from stats alone as to why I think Sam's going to win, I think that Sam, due to his significant reach advantage, his superior grappling skills, and his experience with higher caliber opponents, will likely beat Crosbie. I think that his ability to control his distance and utilize his grappling will be absolutely crucial in neutralizing Crosbie's striking power. However, Patterson does have to be careful of Crosbie's aggressive striking, and he has to work on improving his striking defense in order to avoid getting caught in exchanges. Overall, I think Patterson's well-rounded skill set and his strategic advantages make him the favorite in this matchup, and I think he did work on his striking defense a little bit since he is susceptible to those strikes and those finishes. I wouldn't be surprised if he's improved on that skill set coming into this fight. Overall, I think that Sam Patterson's going to win. I don't think that he's going to get a striking type of finish, but I would say that Sam has a pretty good chance of getting a submission finish. So my final verdict on this fight is taking Sam Patterson via submission. For the next fight, we have Christian Leroy Duncan versus Gregory Rodrigues. Look at that cranium on Gregory Rodrigues. That's crazy. Anyways, let's go and review their stats. Christian Leroy Duncan is 6 feet 2 inches tall with a reach of 79 inches, and he's 29 years old. Now, on the other hand, we have Gregory Rodrigues, who is 6 feet 3 inches tall. He has a reach of 75 inches, and he's 32 years old. So he's a little bit older. He has less of a reach advantage, so he has a disadvantage, and he's 1 inch taller. That's an interesting matchup. Now, when it comes to striking, Christian Leroy Duncan lands 5.96 strikes per minute at a 62% accuracy. Now, Rodrigues, on the other hand, lands 6.08 strikes per minute at a 55% accuracy. So generally, they're in the same range. As far as grappling goes, Duncan lands 0.45 takedowns on average at a 14% accuracy. Now Rodrigues on the other hand lands 2.46 takedowns on average at a better accuracy of 45%, and that's really where the difference is between these two. Now lastly, when it comes to defense, Duncan absorbs 3.82 strikes per minute with a 50% striking defense and a 50% takedown defense, whereas Rodrigues absorbs 5.3 strikes per minute with a 51% striking defense and a pretty decent takedown defense as well. Now let's take a look at Christian Leroy Duncan's recent fight history. Recently, he's coming off of a win against Claudio Ribeiro via KO/TKO back in March of this year. His total record is 10 wins and only 1 loss, and out of his 10 wins, 8 of them were KO/TKOs, 1 of them was a submission, and 1 was a decision victory, which gives him a very high 90% finishing rate. His only loss was a decision loss. He has 4 first-round finishes, recently he's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he's on a 2-fight win streak coming into this fight. Duncan's most recent win was back in March of this year, and his most recent loss was back in June of last year. Now let's take a look at Gregory Rodrigues' recent fight history. He's coming off of a win against Brad Tavares via KO/TKO back in February of this year. His total record is 15 wins and 5 losses, and out of those 15 wins, 10 of them were KO/TKOs, 3 of them were submissions, and 2 were decision victories, which gives him an 87% finishing rate. And out of his 5 losses, 3 of them were via KO/TKO, and the other 2 were decision losses. He has 7 first-round finishes. Recently, he's also won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he's also on a 2-fight win streak coming into this fight. His most recent win was in February of this year, and his most recent loss was in January of last year. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted, their weighted average, and my final pick that takes that and adds other non-statistics based research and fight film study observations into account as well. 2 of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Christian Leroy Duncan, and 4 are leaning towards Gregory Rodrigues. And when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 48.5% probability of victory for Christian Leroy Duncan. Now for my final prediction, I'm giving him a more confident 53% probability of victory, and it's due to the fact that Duncan is 3 years younger, he has a reach advantage of 4 inches, he has a 7% higher striking accuracy, and he absorbs 1.5 less strikes per minute. He's won 10 fights, he's finished 90% of them, he's won 3 of his 4 UFC fights, recently winning 4 out of his last 5, and he's coming off of a 2-fight win streak into this fight. But let's talk about reasons aside from just the stats. Christian Leroy Duncan's youth, his unorthodox striking, and his adaptability could give him an edge against Gregory Rodrigues. His creative fighting style and his ability to make mid-fight adjustments will probably pose a unique challenge for Rodrigues. However, Duncan does need to be careful and overcome Rodrigues' significant experience advantage and his power in order to secure this victory. I think that this fight represents a huge opportunity for Duncan to break into the middleweight rankings and establish himself as a rising contender in this division. Ultimately, I think that Christian Leroy Duncan will make a statement this weekend, and I think he's going to win via KO/TKO. For the next fight, we have Oban Elliott versus Preston Parsons. Let's go and review their stats. Oban Elliott is 6 feet tall with a reach of 72 inches, and he's 26 years old. Now, on the other hand, Preston Parsons 5 feet 11 inches tall with a reach of 71 inches, and he's 29 years old. So these guys are fairly similar when it comes to those overview stats. Now, when it comes to striking, Elliott lands 4.27 strikes per minute at a 53% accuracy. And on the other hand, Parsons lands 3.83 strikes per minute at a 55% accuracy. So when it comes to striking, this is going to be a pretty fun fight. As far as grappling goes, Elliott lands 3.5 takedowns on average at a 50% accuracy, while Parsons on the other hand lands 4.3 takedowns on average with a 43% accuracy. So again, with the grappling, a little bit similar, but Parsons lands a little bit more, but with less accuracy. Now lastly, when it comes to defense, Elliott absorbs 2.17 strikes per minute with a 61% striking defense, and he doesn't really have any takedown defense recorded. Now Parsons on the other hand lands 3.18 strikes per minute, or he absorbs 3.18 strikes per minute. He has a 51% striking defense and an 80% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Oban Elliott's recent fight history. He's recently coming off of a win against Belal Woodburn via unanimous decision, which was back in February of this year. His total record is 10 wins and 2 losses, and out of those 10 wins, 2 of them were KO/TKOs, 3 of them were submissions, and 5 were decision victories, which gives him a 50% finishing rate. And out of his 2 losses, both of them were via KO/TKO, so he might be a little bit vulnerable to those strikes and finishes. He also has 4 first-round finishes. Recently, he's won 5 out of his last 5 fights, and he's currently on a crazy 6-fight win streak. His most recent win was back in February of this year, and his most recent loss was actually all the way back in December of 2021. Now let's take a look at Preston Parsons' recent fight history. Recently, he's coming off of a win against Matthew Semmelsberger via unanimous decision, which was back in January of 2024. His total record is 11 wins and 4 losses, and out of those 11 wins, 9 of them were submissions and 2 were decision victories, which gives him an 82% finishing rate. Now, out of his 4 losses, 2 of them were via KO/TKO, 1 of them was a submission, and the last one was a decision loss. He has 8 first-round finishes. Recently, he's done well. He's won 3 out of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of a win into this fight. His most recent win was back in January of this year. His most recent loss was in March of last year. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted, their weighted average, and my final pick that takes that and adds other non-stat based research and fight film study observations into account as well. 3 of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Oban Elliott, and 4 are leaning towards Preston Parsons. And when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 51.5% probability of victory for Parsons. However, I'm actually going to go opposite of the prediction models here. Don't blame me, it's pretty narrow based on the prediction models, but I'm going to give Oban Elliott a 58.1% probability of victory instead of leaning towards the models, which are very narrow. And there's several reasons for that. On paper, Elliott has a height advantage of 1 inch. He is 3 years younger. He has a reach advantage of 1 inch. He lands 0.44 more strikes per minute. He absorbs 1.01 less strikes per minute. He has a 10% higher striking defense and a 7% higher takedown accuracy. Elliott's also won 10 fights. He's finished half of them. He's won his 1 UFC fight. Recently, he's won all 5 of his last 5 fights, and he's on a 6-fight win streak. The last time he lost, again, was back in December of 2021. But let's talk about reasons aside from stats alone as to why Elliott is likely going to win. I think that Elliott has the upper hand over Parsons due to his versatility in both striking and grappling. I really like his winning streak and what that does to his confidence and momentum. I think he has a strong emotional drive, which stems from some personal motivations that he has. I think his ability as a fighter to switch stances and adapt his fighting style makes him a pretty difficult opponent to predict and counter. Stylistically, Elliott is a tough fighter to beat, especially given Parsons' skill sets. I don't think that Parson has it in him. And I think that Parsons' inconsistencies and his vulnerabilities in striking defense will likely be exploited by Elliott's well-rounded skill set. You do, however, have to be careful of Parsons' really strong submission game, and I think that that's going to remain a significant threat, especially if he takes the fight to the ground, so be careful of that, or if you're betting on this fight. I don't think that Oban Elliott is going to get the finish, so bottom line, I'm going to take Oban Elliott via decision. However, I wouldn't be surprised if Parsons able to take the fight to the ground and get that submission. If the fight remains standing, I think it's Elliott's fight all day. For the next fight, we have Mick Parkin versus Lukasz Brzeski. Let's go and review their stats. Mick is 6 feet 4 inches tall with a reach of 79 inches and is 28 years old. And on the other hand, Lukasz is 6 feet 4 inches tall as well, but with a shorter reach of 1 inch. He has a 78-inch reach, and he's 4 years older at 32 years old. Now, when it comes to striking, Mick lands 4.54 strikes per minute at a 51% accuracy, and Lukasz, on the other hand, lands 4.78 strikes per minute at a 49% accuracy. So on paper, their striking is very similar. As far as grappling goes, Mick lands 1.6 takedowns on average at a 41% accuracy, while Lukasz, on the other hand, lands 0.48 takedowns on average with a 50% accuracy. And lastly, when it comes to defense, Mick absorbs 3.94 strikes per minute with a 59% striking defense and a 50% takedown defense, whereas Lukasz absorbs 3.15 strikes per minute with a 56% striking defense and a 36% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Mick Parkin's recent fight history. Recently, he's coming off of a win against Muhammad Usman via unanimous decision, which was back in March of 2024. His total record is 9 wins and no losses, so he's an undefeated fighter. And out of his 9 wins, 5 of them were via KO/TKO, 1 of them was via submission, and 3 were decision victories, which gives him a 67% finishing rate. Mick has 4 first-round finishes. Recently, of course, he's won all of his fights, and he's on that 9-fight win streak. His most recent win was in March of this year. Now let's take a look at Lukasz Brzeski's recent fight history. Recently, Lukasz is coming off of that win against Walter Walker, which was via unanimous decision back in April of 2024. His total record is 10 wins and 4 losses, and out of those 10 wins, 6 of them were via KO/TKO, 2 of them were submissions, and the other 2 were decision victories, which gives him an 80% finishing rate. And out of his 4 losses, 2 of them were via KO/TKO, and the other 2 were decision losses. He also has 3 first-round finishes, but recently he hasn't done too well. He's only won 2 out of his last 5 fights, but he is coming off of a win into this fight. His most recent win was back in April of this year, just a few months ago. His most recent loss was back in August of last year. All 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Mick Parkin, and none of them are leaning towards Lukasz. And when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 67.6% probability of victory for Mick Parkin. Now, after doing some research outside of stats as well and watching all of their previous fights, I think that the weighted prediction is actually a pretty fair one, and there's a few reasons for that. Statistically, Mick Parkin is 4 years younger, he has a reach advantage of an inch, he has a 2% higher striking accuracy, he has a 3% higher striking defense, he lands 1.12 more takedowns on average, and he has a 14% higher takedown defense. He's won 9 fights, finished 67% of them, hasn't lost any. He's won 3 of his 3 UFC fights, so he has pretty good UFC experience as well. And of course, he's on a 9-fight win streak, if I haven't mentioned that already. Now, talking about reasons aside from stats alone, as to why Mick Parkin holds the upper hand over Lukasz, I think that's due to his confidence, his momentum. He has a very nice balanced skill set as a fighter, and he has a pretty good training environment as well. I think that his ability to handle pressure and his strategic approach to fights will further enhance his chances against a fighter like Lukasz. Now, in contrast, I think that Lukasz's recent inconsistency and his recent performances, his vulnerability to submissions, and precise striking could be detrimental in this fight. He's won 10 fights, he's lost 4. He's not a spectacular fighter. However, I do think that Lukasz does have some knockout power that you have to respect, and it's going to remain a significant threat throughout the fight, and Parkin will have to navigate that very carefully if he wants to come out with a win. So I don't think that Mick Parkin is going to come out swinging and have some crazy wild shots in order to drop Lukasz. I think that actually Mick is going to be very strategic with his striking, but he's going to do a really good job at doing that, and he's going to control the fight with his striking. I think he's going to be able to navigate it, but let's see where his defense is at. That's really the key in this fight. Bottom line, I think that Mick Parkin is going to win via decision. I think it's going to be a strategic fight, and hopefully he's going to be able to stay away from Lukasz's knockout power. For the next fight, we have Caolan Loughran versus Jake Hadley. Let's go ahead and review their stats. Caolan is 5 feet 6 inches tall with a reach of 68 inches, and he's 28 years old. And on the other hand, Hadley is 5 feet 7 inches tall with a reach of 70 inches, and he's 27 years old. Now, when it comes to striking, Loughran lands 6.27 strikes per minute at a 47% accuracy, and Jake Hadley, on the other hand, lands 3.36 strikes per minute at a 42% accuracy. So Caolan definitely has far more volume. As far as grappling goes, Caolan lands 2.5 takedowns on average with a 33% accuracy, while Jake Hadley, on the other hand, only lands 0.24 takedowns on average with a very low 6% accuracy. Obviously, grappling is not a huge part of his game plan. Now, lastly, when it comes to defense, Caolan absorbs 5.73 strikes per minute with a 56% striking defense and no takedown defense really recorded, whereas Jake Hadley absorbs 3.56 strikes per minute with a 60% striking defense and a 35% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Caolan Loughran's recent fight history. Recently, he's coming off of a win against Angel Pacheco via unanimous decision, which was back in March of this year. His total record is 9 wins and only 1 loss, and out of his 9 wins, 5 of them were KO/TKOs, 2 of them were submissions, and the other 2 were decision victories, which gives him a respectable 78% finishing rate. Now, his only loss was a decision loss. He does have 3 first-round finishes, and recently, of course, he's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he's on a 1-fight win streak. His most recent win was back in March of this year, and his most recent loss was in September of 2023. Now, on the other hand, let's go ahead and take a look at Jake Hadley's recent fight history. Recently, Hadley's coming off of a loss against Charles Johnson via unanimous decision, which was back in May of this year, just a couple months ago. His total record is 10 wins and only 3 losses, and out of his 10 wins, 3 of them were KO/TKOs, 5 of them were submissions, and 2 were decision victories, which gives him an 80% finishing rate. And out of his 3 losses, all 3 of them were decision losses. He also has 5 first-round finishes. Recently, he's only won 2 out of his last 5 fights, and he's on a 2-fight losing streak, so he doesn't really have a lot of momentum coming into this fight. The most recent win he's had was back in March of last year, and his most recent loss was in May of this year. Honestly, this fight is very easy to predict. 6 of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Caolan, and only 1 is leaning towards Jake Hadley. And also, Jake Hadley is kind of a last-minute switch-up opponent for Caolan. Now, when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 53.7% probability of victory for Caolan Loughran to win. And for my final prediction, I'm giving him a even more confident 64% probability of victory, and there's several reasons for that. Statistically, he lands 2.91 more strikes per minute, he has a 5% higher striking accuracy, he lands 2.26 more takedowns on average, and he has a 27% higher takedown accuracy. He's won 9 fights, he's finished 78% of them, he's won 1 of his 2 UFC fights, recently winning 4 out of his last 5, and he's coming off of a 1-fight win streak, and he's only really lost 1 fight in his professional fighting career. The last time he lost was actually September of last year, so he's been a very active fighter. But let's talk about reasons aside from stats alone as to why Caolan will likely win. Caolan has really good striking skills, he has championship experience, he has a great mental game, and I think that all of that combined will give him an upper hand over a struggling Jake Hadley. I think that Caolan's recent aggressive style, the way that he fights, and his finishing ability will likely overwhelm Hadley. And not only is Caolan Loughran aggressive, but he also has a pretty decent analytical approach to fighting, which I think means that he's going to be well prepared however this fight goes. Now, it is important to keep in mind that Loughran does have to be cautious of Hadley's submission skills, and he has to avoid underestimating his opponent to capitalize on his advantages and continuing to earn a spot within the UFC. I think that he's going to be able to piece up Jake Hadley. I think that Jake Hadley's recently been struggling, and all of that is going to factor into this fight. I think that Caolan Loughran is going to take this fight to the judges, and he's going to end up getting that unanimous decision. I don't really see him getting the finish in this particular matchup, especially if this fight gets taken to the ground in certain points throughout this fight, and there's some control time that gets piled on, so things kind of slow down. I think that this will ultimately go to the judges, and he's going to get that unanimous decision victory. In the next fight, we have a pretty interesting matchup. We have Molly McCann, who you either like or dislike or don't really know, versus Bruna Brasil. Let's go and review their stats. Molly McCann is 5 feet 4 inches tall with a reach of 62 inches and is 34 years old. And on the other hand, Bruna Brasil is 5 feet 6 inches tall with a reach of 65 inches and is 30 years old. Now, when it comes to striking, Molly McCann lands 5.8 strikes per minute at a 49% accuracy, and Bruna on the other hand lands 2.94 strikes per minute at a 62% accuracy. As far as grappling goes, Molly lands 1.82 takedowns on average with a 38% accuracy, while Bruna on the other hand lands 1.6 takedowns on average with a 62% accuracy. And lastly, when it comes to defense, Molly McCann absorbs 4.94 strikes per minute with a 63% striking defense and a 43% takedown defense, so she's dealt with a lot of volume throughout her fighting career, whereas Bruna Brasil absorbs 3.92 strikes per minute with a 51% striking defense and a 53% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Molly McCann's recent fight history. And the reason that I said that you either like her or you dislike her, because it seems like everyone's either on one side or the other when it comes to Molly McCann. Either you think she's an exciting fighter who has more potential even though she's late into her professional fighting career, or you think that she's a bit overrated and she's going to get stomped out with tougher competition. But anyways, I'll leave the opinions to you guys as always. I'm going to go ahead and review the stats and the analysis. So recently, Molly's coming off of a win against Diana Belbita via submission, which was back in February of this year. Her total record is 14 wins and 6 losses. Now, out of those 14 wins, 6 of them were KO/TKOs, 1 of them was a submission, and 7 were decision victories, which gives her a balanced 50% finishing rate. Now, out of her 6 losses, 3 of them were from submissions, so she does potentially have a little bit of a weakness there, and the other 3 were decision losses. She has 5 first-round finishes. Recently, she's won 3 out of her last 5 fights, and she is coming off of a win into this fight. Her most recent win was in February of this year, and her most recent loss was in July of last year. Now let's take a look at Bruna Brasil's recent fight history. Recently, she's coming off of a loss against Loma Lookboonmee via unanimous decision, which was back in February of this year. Her total record is 8 wins and 4 losses, and out of those 8 wins, 3 of them were KO/TKOs, 2 of them were submissions, and the other 3 were decision victories, which gives her a 56% finishing rate. Now, out of her 4 losses, 3 of them were KO/TKOs, so she might have a little bit of a vulnerability when it comes to finishing, which could play into Molly McCann's favor, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And the other loss was a decision loss. Now, Bruna Brasil does have 1 first-round finish. She's recently done decent. She's won 3 out of her last 5 fights, but she is coming off of a loss into this fight. Her most recent win was in July of last year, and her most recent loss was back in February of this year. Now, when I ran both of these fighters through my prediction models, all 7 of my prediction models leaned towards Molly McCann, and none of them were leaning towards Bruna Brasil. And when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 74.8% probability of victory for Molly McCann. Now, for my final prediction, I am going with Molly McCann, but I'm giving her a little bit less confident 73% probability of victory, and that is due to the fact that Bruna Brasil does have that height advantage of 2 inches. She is 4 years younger, and she has a reach advantage of 3 inches. Not to mention, on paper, she also has a 13% higher striking accuracy. She absorbs 1.02 less strikes per minute. She has a 24% higher takedown accuracy and a 10% higher takedown defense. But the reason I am picking Molly McCann, starting with what's on paper, is due to the fact that Molly McCann lands 2.85 more strikes per minute, she has a 12% higher striking defense, and she lands 0.23 more takedowns on average. She's won 14 fights, finished half of them. She's won 7 out of her 12 UFC fights, so she does have good UFC experience. Even though that's not a high win rate, that's still really valuable experience with good competition over time. And recently she's won 3 out of her last 5 fights, and she's coming off of that 1 win, so she has good momentum. She has at least half of the crowd going for her. But let's talk about reasons aside from stats alone as to why McCann can likely win this fight, or at least why I think that she's likely going to win this fight. I think she has a lot of strengths that will give her an advantage over a fighter like Bruna Brasil, who has half the number of losses that she does wins. But anyways, I like Molly McCann's striking skills, her UFC experience, and her mental toughness. And I think that this fight, although it'll remain competitive, Molly McCann will have the overall upper hand. I think that she's going to be able to keep the fight standing and utilize some of that boxing skill that she has, which will be absolutely crucial, and she's going to be able to defend against Bruna Brasil's superior grappling. Hopefully she doesn't get taken down and just controlled and we get a boring fight. But anyways, I think that some of those intangibles that Molly McCann has going for her, such as her ADHD-driven focus and her great fighting spirit, will likely play a significant role in how she plays out this fight. And I think that ultimately she will get the KO/TKO with those boxing skills she has. I think she's going to be able to get in the pocket, throw some of those mean shots that she does, an uppercut, right hand, really give it to Bruno Silva, and I think Bruno Silva's going to get dropped. She's, again, vulnerable to those strikes and finishes, so this has Molly McCann written all over it. Would I bet on this fight? I don't know. Stick around for later this week when I drop my betting video, and let's find out. But bottom line, I'm going with Molly McCann via KO/TKO, and this one's kind of obvious if I'm being honest with you guys. For the next fight, we have Nathaniel Wood versus Daniel Pineda. Let's go ahead and review their stats. Nathaniel Wood is 5 feet 6 inches tall with a reach of 69 inches and is 31 years old. And on the other hand, Daniel is 5 feet 7 inches tall with the same reach of 69 inches, and he's 7 years older at 38 years old, which is probably going to be a key factor. When it comes to striking, Nathaniel Wood lands 5.91 strikes per minute at a 50% accuracy, and Daniel Pineda, on the other hand, lands 3.09 strikes per minute at a 49% accuracy. Now, as far as grappling goes, Nathaniel Wood lands 1.74 takedowns on average at a 48% accuracy, while Daniel, on the other hand, lands 1.71 takedowns on average, but at a much lower 25% accuracy. And lastly, when it comes to defense, Wood absorbs 4.22 strikes per minute with a 56% striking defense and a 70% takedown defense, whereas Pineda absorbs 3.18 strikes per minute with a 46% striking defense and a 48% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Nathaniel Wood's recent fight history. Recently, he's coming off of a loss against Muhammad Naimov via unanimous decision, which was back in October of 2023. His total record is 20 wins and 6 losses, and out of those 20 wins, 9 of them were KO/TKOs, 5 of them were submissions, and 6 were decision victories, which gives him a 70% finishing rate. Now, out of his 6 losses, 2 of them were KO/TKOs, 2 of them were submissions, and the other 2 were decision losses. He does have 7 first-round finishes. Recently, he's done pretty decently. He's won 3 out of his last 5 fights, but he is coming off of a loss into this matchup. His most recent win was in July of last year, and his most recent loss was in October of last year as well. Now let's take a look at Daniel Pineda's recent fight history. Recently, Daniel's coming off of a loss against Alex Cazares via unanimous decision, which was back in June of 2023. Now, Daniel's total record is 28 wins and 15 losses, a true veterans type of record. Out of his 28 wins, 9 of them were KO/TKOs, an astounding 19 were submissions, and none were decision victories, which gives him a crazy 100% finishing rate. Now, out of his 15 losses, 3 of them were via KO/TKO, 6 of them were via submissions, and 6 were decision losses. He also has 17 first-round finishes, but recently he hasn't done too well. He's recently won only 2 out of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of a loss into this fight. Now, Pineda's most recent win was back in March of last year. His most recent loss was in June of last year as well. He's kind of at the end of his professional fighting career. Again, he's 38 years old, so let's keep that in mind. So let's talk predictions for this fight. When I ran both of these fighters through my prediction models, 6 out of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Nathaniel Wood, and only 1 is leaning towards Daniel Pineda. Now, when we weigh those prediction models together, we're getting a 63.2% probability of victory for Nathaniel Wood. Now, for my final prediction, after doing all of my research and looking at things outside of statistics, watching that fight film stuff, all that fun stuff, I'm giving Nathaniel Wood a more confident 75% probability of victory. And let's first start with the statistical reasons as to why. For starters, Nathaniel Wood is 7 years younger. He lands 2.82 more strikes per minute. He has a 1% higher striking accuracy, although that's not much. He has a 10% higher striking defense. He lands 0.03 more takedowns on average. Again, not that much. He has a 23% higher takedown accuracy, and he has a 22% higher takedown defense. Now, Nathaniel Wood has won 20 fights. He's finished 70% of them. He's won 7 of his 10 UFC fights, which not only gives him really good fight experience, especially with those being within the UFC, but that gives him a pretty high win rate within the UFC as well. 7 out of 10 is pretty impressive. And recently he's won 3 out of his last 5 fights. The last time he lost was in October of 2023, but let's go ahead and talk about reasons aside from stats alone as to why Nathaniel Wood is likely going to win. I think that he holds several advantages over Daniel Pineda heading into their fight. I think that Wood's youth, his recent form, his technical skill, and his cardio will give him an edge over the veteran Pineda. While Pineda's experience and his submission skills definitely pose a threat, and we have to respect that, I think that Wood's well-rounded game and his mental toughness will make him the likely victor in this fight. I think this fight really represents an opportunity for Wood to solidify his position in this division and potentially break into the rankings. So I'm going to take Nathaniel Wood via decision. I don't think that he gets the finish, especially against a experienced and technical fighter such as Pineda, but I do think that he's going to be able to maintain control and get that unanimous decision victory. Now for the next fight, we have a fight that I personally am very excited to watch, and that's Arnold Allen versus Giga Chikadze. Let's go and review their stats. Arnold Allen is 5 feet 8 inches tall with a reach of 70 inches, and he's 30 years old. And on the other hand, Giga Chikadze is 6 feet tall, which is a pretty big height difference there, and he has a reach of 74 inches, so he also has a 4-inch reach advantage, but he is 35 years old, so he's 5 years older, kind of heading into the late stage of his fighting career. Now when it comes to striking, Arnold Allen lands 3.4 strikes per minute at a 40% accuracy, and Giga Chikadze on the other hand lands 4.08 strikes per minute at a 43% accuracy. So Giga does have the advantage when it comes to striking, at least on paper. Now, as far as grappling goes, Arnold lands 1.02 takedowns on average with a 50% accuracy, while Giga Chikadze on the other hand lands only 0.23 takedowns on average with a 33% accuracy, and generally it's not a very big part of his game plan coming into fights. Lastly, when it comes to defense, Arnold Allen absorbs 2.91 strikes per minute with a 61% striking defense and a 75% takedown defense, whereas Chikadze absorbs 3.44 strikes per minute with a 62% striking defense and a 69% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Arnold Allen's recent fight history. Recently, Allen's coming off of a loss against Movsar Evloev via unanimous decision back in January of this year. His total record is 19 wins and 3 losses, and out of his 19 wins, 7 of them were KO/TKOs, 4 of them were submissions, and 8 were decision victories, which gives him a 58% finishing rate. All 3 of his losses were decision losses. He has 4 first-round finishes. Recently, he's won 3 out of his last 5 fights, but it's important to note that he has been on a 2-fight losing streak coming into this fight. So his most recent win was back in October of 2022, which is not very impressive at all, and his most recent loss was back in January of 2024. When it comes to Arnold Allen, a lot of people are just questioning if he still has it in him, if he still has those skills that he had and all that potential that he had when he was quickly rising up, or if he's kind of washed now. So again, leaving the opinion up to you guys, not to take away from what he has accomplished previously. Anyways, let's continue. So now let's take a look at Giga Chikadze's recent fight history. Recently, Chikadze is coming off of that win against Alex Cazares via unanimous decision, which was back in August of 2023. Now his total record is 15 wins and only 3 losses, and out of those 15 wins, an astounding 9 of them were KO/TKOs, 1 of them was a submission, and 5 were decision victories, which gives him a 67% finishing rate. Out of his 3 losses, 1 was a submission and the other 2 were decision losses. He does have 9 first-round finishes. Recently he's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he is coming off of a win into this fight. His most recent win was back in August of 2023, and his most recent loss was back in January of 2022. I gotta be honest, this one was a really tough one for me. Let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted. Only 1 out of 7 of the prediction models are leaning towards Arnold Allen, and the other 6 are leaning towards Giga Chikadze. And when I weigh those together, I'm getting a 62% probability of victory for Giga Chikadze to win. However, I'm actually going opposite of the prediction models here based on my research and watching Arnold Allen's fights and Giga Chikadze's fights, and I'm going to give Arnold Allen a 58.7% probability of victory. And on paper, there's a few reasons for that, and stylistically, there's a few reasons for that as well. First, let's start on paper. Arnold Allen is 5 years younger. He absorbs 0.53 less strikes per minute. He lands 0.79 more takedowns on average. He has a 17% higher takedown accuracy. He has a 7% higher takedown defense, and he lands a little bit more submissions on average. I think it's 0.2. Now, Arnold Allen has won 19 fights. He's finished 58% of them. He's won 10 of his 12 UFC fights, and I think it's very important to keep that in mind. He not only has really good UFC experience, but he has a very high win rate within the UFC. And in order to be fair, I do acknowledge and understand that he has lost 2 of his recent fights and he hasn't really gotten a win in a while, so I do understand that. But he still won 3 out of his last 5 fights, and he does have the set of skills needed in order to have the potential to beat someone like Giga Chikadze, especially considering that he's not dealing with a prime Giga Chikadze. He's dealing with a Giga Chikadze that's in the late stage of his fighting career. But let's go ahead and talk about reasons aside from stats alone as to why I personally pick Arnold Allen. And I know some of y'all might disagree with me here. That's totally fine. I'm presenting you guys all the stats, all the analysis, prediction model results. If you're going for Giga and trying to get that value bet, I totally understand. But I'm just going to make my case here. So aside from the age factor, we have to keep in mind that Arnold Allen does have a well-rounded skill set and he has versatile striking. He did improve his wrestling and he has a pretty decent fight IQ as well, especially if you watch his previous fights. His experience against those top-tier opponents and his ability to adapt mid-fight do provide him a strategic advantage. Now, while Chikadze's powerful and diverse striking will definitely pose a significant threat throughout this fight, and respectfully, I think that Chikadze does have a very good chance of getting it done. I'm not going to take that away from him. I will say that Allen's ability to mix up his attacks and exploit Chikadze's weaknesses, especially in grappling and defense, could be decisive factors. Overall, I think that Allen's comprehensive approach and his adaptability make him a challenging opponent. I think he has a lot to prove after coming off of 2 losses. I think that you do have to ultimately consider that Giga Chikadze is on the late stage of his career, even though he's one hell of a fighter. Ultimately, I ended up leaning towards Arnold Allen. I totally respect and understand if you're going towards Giga here. I don't think that Allen's going to get the finish, so bottom line, I'm going Allen via decision. This is going to be a very interesting fight, though. I think that it has huge implications for both Allen and Giga Chikadze for both of their professional careers in a different sense for each of them. But it's going to be an exciting fight, and I really look forward to this one. Now for the next fight, we have another banger. We have Muhammad Mokaev versus Manel Kape. Let's go and review their stats. Mokaev is 5 feet 7 inches tall with a reach of 70 inches, and he's only 23 years old. And on the other hand, we have Manel Kape, who's 5 feet 5 inches tall with a reach of 68 inches, and he's 30 years old. So he's 2 inches shorter, he has a reach disadvantage of 2 inches, and he's 7 years older. When it comes to striking, Mokaev lands 1.53 strikes per minute at a 48% accuracy, and Kape on the other hand lands 5.12 strikes per minute at a 54% accuracy. Now as far as grappling goes, Mokaev lands 5.75 takedowns on average with a 41% accuracy, while Kape on the other hand lands only 0.65 takedowns on average with a lower 37% accuracy. And lastly, when it comes to defense, Mokaev absorbs 1.36 strikes per minute with a 57% striking defense and no takedown defense recorded, whereas Kape absorbs 4.51 strikes per minute with a 59% striking defense and a 77% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Muhammad Mokaev's recent fight history. Recently, Mokaev is coming off of a win against Alex Perez via unanimous decision, which was back in March of 2024. His total record is 12 wins and no losses. He's a crazy undefeated young fighter. And out of his 12 wins, 2 of them were via KO/TKO, 6 of them were via submission, and 4 were decision victories, which gives him a 67% balanced finish rate. Now, he does have 3 first-round finishes, and he is on a 7-fight win streak. His most recent win was in March of this year. Now let's flip over to Manel Kape's recent fight history. Recently, Kape is coming off of that win against Felipe dos Santos via unanimous decision, which was back in September of 2023. His total record is 19 wins and 6 losses, and out of those 19 wins, 11 of them were KO/TKOs, 5 of them were submissions, and 3 were decisions, which gives him an 84% finishing rate. Now out of his 6 losses, 2 of them were submission losses, and the other 4 were decision losses. He also has 9 first-round finishes. Recently, he's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he's on a 4-fight win streak, which is pretty impressive. Now, his most recent win was back in September of 2023, and his most recent loss was all the way back in March of 2021. Now let's take a look at those prediction models and what they're saying, those weighted averages, and my final pick that takes that and adds other non-stat based research and fight film study observations into account as well. 4 of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Muhammad Mokaev, and 3 are leaning towards Manel Kape. And when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a very narrow 50.3% probability of victory in favor of Manel Kape. However, granted, that's very narrow, so don't be upset that I'm not going for the models here. I'm going to go opposite of these models, and I'm going to give Muhammad Mokaev a 54.3% probability of victory. Keep in mind that is fairly narrow, so Manel Kape does have a really good chance of still getting it done, but I think that Mokaev, on paper, here's his advantages as to why I think he's going to win. He has a height advantage of 2 inches. He is 7 years younger. He has a huge amount of momentum going for him. He has a reach advantage of 2 inches. He absorbs 3.15 less strikes per minute. He lands 5.1 more takedowns on average. He has a 4% higher takedown accuracy, and he lands 0.6 more submissions on average. He's won 12 fights, finished 67% of them, won all 6 of his UFC fights, which is impressive. You know, he has good UFC experience, so it's not like he's coming off of some weird promotion and he's just making his UFC debut. He's been in the UFC, he's been a little bit tested, maybe not some of the greater fighters, but he still has been tested and he's passed those exams. He also is on that 7-fight win streak. But let's go ahead and talk about reasons aside from stats alone as to why Mokaev will likely win. I think that he has the advantage over Manel Kape due to his exceptional wrestling and grappling skills, which have allowed him to absolutely dominate his opponents with his control time and his effective submissions. I think that relentless pressure that he adds and his adaptability throughout fights will further strengthen his position. Now, I do understand that Kape is an experienced and explosive fighter whose aggressive striking style will absolutely play a crucial role into this fight. He can absolutely catch Mokaev and end the fight, but I will say that Kape's defensive lapses and his inconsistency as a fighter will probably be exploited by Mokaev's grappling-centric approach. I think that a victory for Mokaev could significantly enhance his path towards a title shot, especially given what he's been able to achieve so far, but I must say that Kape's striking power will remain a notable threat in this fight. This is an absolute banger of a fight. Highly recommend you guys watch it. Ultimately, I'm going to take Muhammad Mokaev via decision. I don't think he's going to get that submission, although I wouldn't be surprised if he does. But bottom line, I'm going Muhammad Mokaev. I think he's going to control the fight. He's going to land some of that ground and pound. He's going to take it to the cage's side and pretty much dominate Manel Kape. Try to keep the fight away from the feet, because if the fight is on the feet, you know that Kape will have that advantage. Now for the next fight, we have another absolute banger. UFC 304 is going to be extremely exciting to watch. I highly advise that you guys get with your friends, your family, have a good time, watch this event. You're not going to want to miss this pay-per-view. So the next fight is Bobby Green versus Paddy Pimblett. Now, Bobby Green is 5 feet 10 inches tall with a reach of 71 inches and he's 37 years old. And on the other hand, Paddy Pimblett is also 5 feet 10 inches tall, but he has a better reach of 2 inches. He has a 73-inch reach and he is way younger at 29 years old, which will probably play a crucial role in this fight. Although Bobby Green, I mean, he's an absolute killer. Regardless, we all know how he fights. He's a scrapper. He's great at striking. Anyways, before I get into the stylistic stuff, let's focus on the stats. When it comes to striking, Bobby Green lands 6.45 strikes per minute at a 52% accuracy. Now, Paddy Pimblett, on the other hand, lands 5.13 strikes per minute at also a 52% accuracy, which is very interesting when it comes to striking stats. Both of these guys are fairly similar, but Bobby Green lands a little bit more volume given his loose, hands-down striking approach. Now, as far as grappling goes, Bobby Green lands 1.19 takedowns on average with a 38% accuracy, and Paddy Pimblett, on the other hand, lands only 0.98 takedowns on average with a lower 25% accuracy. And when it comes to defense, Bobby Green absorbs 3.75 strikes per minute with a 62% striking defense, which is very impressive, but a lot of it has to do with his style and his stance. Very intentional, by the way. And he has a 74% takedown defense, whereas Paddy Pimblett absorbs 3.7 strikes per minute, which again is very similar to the number of strikes that Bobby Green absorbs, but he has a 41% striking defense, which is not a good look for Paddy, and he has a 56% takedown defense. So let's start with Bobby Green's recent fight history. Recently, Bobby Green is coming off of that win against Jim Miller via unanimous decision, which was back in April 13, 2024. That was a great fight. I was really hoping Jim Miller was going to be able to win, but Bobby Green, of course, did what Bobby Green does best, and he absolutely pieced Jim Miller together. Highly advise you guys watch that fight. I'm hoping all of you did watch that because I think that was on UFC 300. Hopefully you did not miss an event like UFC 300. Anyways, I'm rambling. Bobby Green's total record is a crazy 32 wins and 15 losses. And out of his 32 wins, 11 of them were KO/TKOs, 9 of them were submissions, and 12 were decision victories. I mean, what an absolute balanced fighter. He has a 63% finishing rate, and out of his 15 losses, 5 of them were KO/TKOs, 2 of them were submissions, and 8 of them were decision losses. So he doesn't frequently get KO/TKO'd or gets finished or submitted. A lot of the times he gets out-controlled, the fight goes to the judges, and they end up giving his opponent the victory when he loses. Now, he does have 11 first-round finishes. Recently, he's won 3 out of his last 5 fights, and he is coming off of that win against Jim Miller, which was a pretty good win. And so he has some momentum coming with him. He's also a fan favorite. He's one of those Nate Diaz-style fighters. His most recent win was again in April of this year, and his most recent loss was in December of last year. He's a very active fighter too as well, which we have to pay some respect to Bobby Green for being an active fighter like that. Now let's go ahead and take a look at Paddy Pimblett's recent fight history. Recently, Paddy's coming off of a win against Tony Ferguson via unanimous decision back in December of 2023. And I don't know what fight these guys are talking about. Tony Ferguson never loses. He's never lost. So I don't remember that fight. Do you guys remember that fight? Because I don't. Anyways, sorry for the delusion here, but come on, everyone loves El Cucuy. Anyways, Paddy Pimblett's total record is 21 wins and 3 losses. And out of those 21 wins, 6 of them were KO/TKOs, 9 of them were submissions, and 6 were decision victories, which gives him a 72% finishing rate. Out of his 3 losses, 1 was a submission loss and the other 2 were decision losses. He has 11 first-round finishes. Recently, he's won all 5 of his last 5 fights, and he's on a 7-fight win streak. His most recent win was in December of 2023. His most recent loss was all the way back in September of 2018. Now let's take a look at what my prediction models predicted, their weighted average, and my final pick that takes that and adds other non-stat based research and fight film study observations into account as well. 5 of 7 of my prediction models are going towards Bobby Green, and 2 are leaning towards Paddy Pimblett. However, when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 51.9% probability of victory for Paddy Pimblett. Now for my final prediction, I am going for the underdog here. I'm going to give Paddy Pimblett an even more confident 55% probability of victory, and that's due to the fact that he is 8 years younger. He does have a reach advantage of 2 inches. He absorbs a little bit less strikes per minute, and he lands 1.3 more submissions on average. Now, Paddy Pimblett has won 21 fights. He's finished 72% of them. He's won all 5 of his 5 UFC fights, although some of them I do understand and acknowledge were easy. He's recently won, of course, all of his fights, and he's on that 7-fight win streak. Last time he lost, keep in mind, was at September of 2018. But let's talk about the styles of both of these fighters and why I think Paddy Pimblett is going to come out on top. I think that his grappling skills and his mental resilience, coupled with the support of his home crowd, will give him the potential edge over Bobby Green in this fight. However, Bobby Green's extensive experience and his superior striking does present significant challenges for Paddy Pimblett that he's going to have to overcome if he wants to win this fight. He's not an underdog in this fight for no reason. Bobby Green is likely to win, at least based on the odds, right? So Paddy Pimblett will have to capitalize on Green's recent chin issues, and he's going to have to maintain a well-rounded strategy and be very careful to secure this victory. Conversely, Green will need to leverage his striking and his experience to overcome Paddy's grappling threats. At the end of the day, I think that Paddy is going to win this fight. I think he's going to continue on his win streak in the UFC, and he's going to keep making a name for himself. Bobby Green is going to give him a tough time in that octagon, though. You can expect him to give him those taunts and, some of that disrespect. He's not really going to respect Paddy's skills in there. He's going to do what Bobby Green does best, And Bobby Green's a tough fighter. He's kind of one of those dog fighters. He's tough. He can take a bunch of shots. He gives a bunch of shots. He lands a lot of volume. And Paddy does absorb a lot of volume compared to Bobby Green. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic. But regardless, all things considered, I am leaning towards Paddy Pimblett here. He is an underdog. I think there's value in him. I'm not going to say he's like the best fighter in the world, but I think there's potential for him to please the home crowd, get the victory. At least the unanimous decision. I'm not going to say anything crazy like Paddy Pimblett finishes Bobby Green. I think that would be a bit of a stretch. But I do see him eking out that victory, it going to the judges, and him getting that win. The next fight is a huge fight for the heavyweight division. It's a championship level fight. It's our co-main event. It's Tom Aspinall versus Curtis Blaydes, number 2. Number 1 was back in 2022. It ended very, very early. There was a knee injury that Tom Aspinall had suffered. He tried to throw a kick and his right knee pretty much gave out and he fell to the canvas in pain. So they didn't really have much of a first fight. This is the rematch. It's for the championship. A lot of implications here, especially when you consider just John Jones kind of in the background there. But anyways, let's focus on this fight, this co-main event, this banger fight. here's what we have. Tom Aspinall is 6 feet 5 inches tall with a reach of 78 inches, and he's 31 years old. He's pretty young. Now, on the other hand, Curtis Blaydes is 6 feet 4 inches tall with a reach of 80 inches and is 33 years old. So Curtis Blaydes is 1 inch shorter. He has a reach advantage of 2 inches, and he is 2 years older. Now, when it comes to striking, Tom Aspinall lands 7.72 strikes per minute at a 66% accuracy. That's very impressive given his weight class. Now, Curtis Blaydes, on the other hand, he only lands 3.53 strikes per minute at a 50% accuracy. So you can clearly see who has that striking advantage on paper, right? Now, as far as grappling goes, Tom Aspinall lands 3.46 takedowns on average with a pretty decent accuracy, while Curtis Blaydes, on the other hand, lands 5.72 takedowns on average at a 53% accuracy. And lastly, when it comes to defense, Tom Aspinall absorbs 2.77 strikes per minute with a 66% striking defense and a pretty decent takedown defense, whereas Curtis Blaydes, on the other hand, absorbs 1.83 strikes per minute with a 59% striking defense and a low 31% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Tom Aspinall's recent fight history. Recently, Tom Aspinall is coming off of a win against Sergey Pavlovich via KO/TKO, which was back in November of 2023. Aspinall's total record is 14 wins and only 2 losses. And out of those 14 wins, 10 of them were KO/TKOs and 4 were submissions, which gives him a very impressive 100% finishing rate. Tom Aspinall also has 13 first-round finishes. Recently, he's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he is on a 2-fight win streak. So keep in mind, out of his 14 wins, he has 13 first-round finishes. Very impressive. Now, his most recent win was back in November of 2023, and his most recent loss was all the way back in July of 2022. Now let's take a look at Curtis Blaydes' recent fight history. Recently, he's coming off of a win against Jailton Almeida via KO/TKO, which was back in March of this year. His total record is 18 wins and only 4 losses. Now, out of his 18 wins, 13 of them were KO/TKOs, and the other 5 were decision victories, which gives him a respectable 72% finishing rate. Now, out of his 4 losses, all of them were KO/TKO finishes, which, if you put 2 and 2 together, with Aspinall being a high-level finisher and Curtis Blaydes having a bit of a weakness bias in his losses towards finishes, that doesn't exactly look too good with Curtis Blaydes. But we're going to put a pin on that. We're going to keep it going. Curtis Blaydes has 3 first-round finishes. Recently, he's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he is on a 1-fight win streak coming into this fight. His most recent win was back in March of this year, and his most recent loss was in April of last year. Alright guys, let's talk predictions and logic. So when I look at my prediction models, those weighted averages, and my final pick, that takes that and adds other non-stat based research and fight film study observations into account as well, we get a very heavily biased result. All 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Tom Aspinall, and none are leaning towards Curtis Blaydes. Surprise, surprise. Now, when I weigh those prediction models together, I'm getting a 63% probability of victory for Tom Aspinall. But for my final prediction, given all my research and watching those fight films, I'm going to give Tom Aspinall a way more confident 73% probability of victory. So first, let's talk stats. Tom Aspinall has a height advantage of 1 inch. He is 2 years younger. He lands 4.19 more strikes per minute, which is key, especially when you consider Curtis Blaydes' losing tendencies and Tom Aspinall's strengths and his volume. He also has a 16% higher striking accuracy. He has a 8% higher striking defense. He has a 47% higher takedown accuracy and a 69% higher takedown defense. Now, Tom Aspinall has won 14 fights. He's finished all of them. He's won 7 of his 8 UFC fights, and his loss wasn't really much of a loss. Also, he's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of a 2-fight win streak into this fight. Now, let's talk about those reasons aside from stats alone as to why I think Tom Aspinall is going to win. Tom Aspinall's speed, his well-rounded skill set, and his recent performances definitely give him an edge over a fighter like Curtis Blaydes. His ability to threaten in all areas of MMA, combined with his home crowd advantage in Manchester, makes him a very challenging opponent for Curtis Blaydes. Now, while Blaydes does have good wrestling, and that's going to remain a pretty significant threat, I think that Aspinall's diverse striking and his submission skills will provide multiple paths to victory for him, potentially allowing him to overcome Blaydes' grappling-focused approach. I just think that Tom Aspinall is the way better fighter all around, unless Curtis Blaydes happens to pull off a miracle and get lucky. But 9 times out of 10, I would take Tom Aspinall. So, bottom line, I'm taking Tom Aspinall via KO/TKO. He could take it to the judges and win that way. I could even see him doing something crazy and getting a submission. But if you talk about what's going to happen most likely based on statistics and the styles of both of these fighters, it's no surprise that I'm taking Tom Aspinall via KO/TKO. And for the next fight, we have our main event for UFC 304. We have Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad. Let's go and review their stats. Leon Edwards is 6 feet 2 inches tall with a reach of 74 inches, and he's 32 years old. And on the other hand, we have Belal Muhammad, who is 5 feet 11 inches tall with a reach of 72 inches, and he is 36 years old. When it comes to striking, Leon Edwards lands 2.75 strikes per minute with a 53% accuracy. And Belal, on the other hand, lands 4.55 strikes per minute with a slightly lower 43% accuracy. Now, as far as grappling goes, Leon lands 1.25 takedowns on average with a 34% accuracy, while Belal, on the other hand, lands much more. He lands 1.98 takedowns on average with pretty much the same accuracy of 35%. And lastly, when it comes to defense, Leon Edwards absorbs 2.34 strikes per minute with a 54% striking defense and a 70% takedown defense, whereas Belal absorbs 3.64 strikes per minute with a 57% striking defense and a 93% takedown defense. Now let's take a look at Leon Edwards' recent fight history. Recently, he's coming off of a win against Colby Covington via unanimous decision back in December of 2023. His total record is 22 wins and only 2 losses, and out of his 22 wins, 7 of them were KO/TKOs, 3 of them were submissions, and 12 were decision victories, which gives him a 45.5% finishing rate. He hasn't gotten finished when it comes to his losses. All of his losses were decision losses. He has 5 first-round finishes. Recently, he's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he's on a 4-fight win streak, 2 of which were against a fighter like Kamaru Usman. I mean, this guy really ended Kamaru Usman's career. I know he's still fighting, but still. However, in Kamaru Usman's defense, that first fight against Leon Edwards did not look good for Leon Edwards at all. If you haven't seen that fight, it was a very last-minute, last-second type of victory where Leon Edwards really just landed the perfect kick that dropped Kamaru Usman. But in their rematch, he definitely earned that victory. So keep in mind, Leon Edwards does deserve to be here. The last time he lost was actually all the way back in 2015, so that's a key thing to keep in mind. However, I will say Leon Edwards hasn't been tested as much as I want to see him get tested. So seeing him fight a fighter like Belal Muhammad, who has been on a tear, he's on a great fight win streak, it's going to be very crucial for Leon Edwards' career. So this fight does have very high implications, and that's what makes it a very exciting main event. Even though from some of the more casual fans that haven't really been watching UFC for a while and don't really understand the different dynamics and implications that fights have, and especially with fighters that have different styles, they're going to say that this isn't a very exciting main event, but I couldn't disagree more. I think that this main event is great for both of these fighters. It carries very heavy implications for their futures and their positioning in this division. I mean, if Belal wins, it could pretty much change this division's trajectory, and if Leon wins, he further solidifies exactly why he deserves to be here. So now, moment of truth, let's go ahead and take a look at what my prediction models predicted, their weighted average, and my final pick that takes all that and adds other non-stat based research and fight film study observations into account as well. So 2 of 7 of my prediction models are leaning towards Leon Edwards and 5 are leaning towards Belal Muhammad. Interesting, right? But when we weigh those prediction models together, we get a 50.2% probability of victory for Leon Edwards. Now for my final prediction, I'm going to give Leon Edwards a more confident 60% probability of victory. And statistically speaking, the reason for that is that Leon Edwards does have the height advantage of 3 inches. He is 4 years younger, and in that 30s range for MMA fighters, being 4 years younger is an advantage for sure. He has a reach advantage of 2 inches. He has a 10% higher striking accuracy. He absorbs 1.3 less strikes per minute, and he lands 0.2 more submissions on average. Leon Edwards has won 22 fights. He's finished 46% of them. He's won 14 of his 17 UFC fights. Last time he lost was all the way back in 2015. Recently, he's won 4 out of his last 5 fights, and he's coming off of a 4-fight win streak. But let's talk about those crucial reasons, aside from stats alone, as to why Leon Edwards will likely defeat Belal Muhammad. I think that Leon Edwards can defeat Belal Muhammad by leveraging his superior technical striking, his strong defensive grappling, and his extensive experience against high-caliber opponents like Kamaru Usman. Now, fighting in his home country of England provides an additional psychological edge that a lot of people might not consider, but it definitely plays a role in Leon Edwards' confidence. I think his ability to maintain his distance and control the pace will be very crucial to neutralizing Muhammad's relentless pressure and his wrestling, which you absolutely cannot underestimate. Belal Muhammad has gotten better over time, and he's trained with insanely talented fighters and technically skilled fighters like those Dagestani wrestlers and grapplers, and I know he's picked up a thing or two from those guys. So I do respect what Belal Muhammad is bringing to this fight, and I do think that he has a good chance of pulling it off, pulling the upset off, and getting that victory. But While Muhammad is a challenging opponent and he has exceptional cardio and a high volume approach, I think that Edwards' precision, his mental toughness, and his tactical acumen do make him the more well-equipped fighter to secure a victory here. I don't think he's going to be able to finish Muhammad, but I am taking Leon Edwards via decision. I also want to give you guys some important context. This is a rematch between these two fighters. They previously fought back in 2021 at a UFC fight night, and that fight had ended with a no contest because of an accidental eye poke that Leon Edwards had done. It was in the second round, and Edwards had poked Muhammad in the eye while he was throwing a kick. And the poke was pretty severe if you watch it. But regardless, in that first fight, if you take a look at it, Edwards was doing pretty good. But I think Belal has come a long way within those few years, so that first fight is pretty meaningless in terms of trying to make some sort of an analysis or basis of how this fight will go. Both fighters have grown a ton between then. Anyways, the play is Leon Edwards via unanimous decision. And with that, those are all of the fights for this weekend's event. I hope you all enjoyed the analysis and that your bets hit. Thank you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe as it'll help keep me motivated in creating these videos. Running this data, analysis, prediction models, and creating charts and graphs takes hours every day and week, so your support is always appreciated. Please also check out my Patreon if you'd like to support me through there. There's a $10 a month contribution option and a premium $20 a month option, which comes with early access to all of the analysis from this video, as well as promising underdogs, favorites, prop bets, and all of the extra data analysis and stats as well. This analysis, information, and these stats will help you with your bets, and it'll help support my efforts to continue providing and expanding content for you all. So please check out that Patreon if you want to show me some love and help me out there. Thank you all once again for watching, and as always, see you guys in the next one.